Oh my God, what is that thing doing at our table? The voice pierced through the elegant atmosphere of Melbourne's exclusive Sovereign Crown Club like nails on a chalkboard. Did security seriously let someone from the street wander in here? Victoria Blackstone stood behind her chair, designer champagne flute in one hand, her face twisted in disgust as she stared at the woman seated across from her. I mean, seriously, look at this circus act. What is that supposed to be? Some kind of African costume party? The woman she mocked sat with quiet dignity in a stunning traditional African print dress, rich emerald and gold patterns that seemed to glow under the crystal chandeliers. Her head wrap was arranged with artistic elegance, and despite the venomous words, CEO Amira Osei remained perfectly still, hands folded on the white linen tablecloth. Victoria's laugh was shrill, meant to draw attention from every corner of the opulent dining room overlooking the Yarra River. Honestly, who invited Pocahontas to our little gathering? This isn't some multicultural festival in Footscray, darling. This is the Sovereign Crown Club where people with actual breeding come to dine. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd of Melbourne's elite, mining executives, tech billionaires, and old money families who had gathered for what was supposed to be a celebration. But Victoria was just getting started. That outfit is so loud I can practically hear the drums beating from here, she sneered, gesturing dramatically. And what's with the head decoration? Are you expecting to perform some tribal dance for our entertainment? The room grew uncomfortable. Some guests looked away, others pulled out their phones, sensing drama brewing. Victoria basked in the attention, her silver sequined gown catching the light as she moved closer to her target. I'm sorry, but someone needs to explain to our exotic guest that this is a civilized establishment. We don't do primitive fashion shows here. Her voice dripped with calculated cruelty. Maybe there's been some mistake? Perhaps you're looking for the community center down in Dandenong. Before we dive deeper into this shocking confrontation, pause and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? Australia? Somewhere else in the world? And have you ever witnessed someone being publicly humiliated like this? Hit that subscribe button because what's about to unfold will absolutely blow your mind. This story of dignity versus arrogance is one you'll never forget. Victoria reached for the crystal pitcher of ice water from the service station, her movements theatrical and deliberate. The room held its breath. Even the string quartet seemed to pause their performance. You know what? Victoria announced, her voice carrying across the marble-columned hall. I think our little visitor needs to cool down and remember where she really belongs. Without warning, she tilted the pitcher forward. A cascade of ice-cold water poured down like a waterfall, soaking into Amira's beautiful head wrap and streaming across the intricate patterns of her African print dress. The water traced down her face, past her temples, creating dark stains across the vibrant fabric. The sound of liquid hitting cloth echoed unnaturally loud in the suddenly silent room. Gasps erupted from several tables. Phones shot up instantly, cameras hungry for scandal. A businessman's wife covered her mouth in shock. A group of young men in tailored suits leaned back, grinning as if they just witnessed premium entertainment. Victoria threw back her head and laughed triumphantly, holding the empty pitcher high like a trophy. That's much better. All that flashy African nonsense was giving me a headache anyway. Water suits you so much more. Her voice rang out across the Sovereign Crown Club, arrogant and cutting. Some guests laughed on cue. Others clapped nervously. Everyone understood the message. This was supposed to be dominance. But CEO Amira Osei did not move. She did not flinch. She did not wipe the water dripping from her soaked head wrap. She simply sat there, letting it run down her face and onto the pristine white tablecloth. Her hands remained perfectly composed on the table, as if she were made of stone. Her eyes lifted slowly. Not a desperate glance, not a plea for mercy. It was deliberate, calculated, and when her gaze locked onto Victoria's smug face, something shifted in the room's energy. The laughter began to falter. One by one, the cruel chuckles died in throats. The ripple of mockery collapsed into an uncomfortable silence that seemed to press against the ornate walls. Victoria shifted slightly, her smirk wavering, but she forced another giggle, tossing her perfectly styled hair. "Come on, don't be shy. Smile for all these lovely cameras," she taunted, gesturing at the glowing phone screens aimed at their table. But even Victoria could feel the current changing. The spectacle was no longer hers to control. The soaked woman didn't need words. Her stillness was louder than shouting, heavier than rage. Every drop that fell from her chin to the linen was an unspoken declaration. Every second of silence built pressure that Victoria's laughter couldn't dispel. The dining hall itself seemed to bend around Amira's composure. The chandeliers sparkled above, but somehow the spotlight had shifted. The woman dripping with water was no longer the object of ridicule. She was becoming something else entirely, something unshakable, a center of gravity that every gaze now circled. The silence didn't last long. Whispers began to coil through the room like smoke. One woman leaned toward her husband, her diamonds catching the light as she muttered behind her manicured hand, "Did you see that? She just sat there like a queen." Another man chuckled nervously, shaking his head. "She won't last 5 minutes in this crowd. Not after that display." But not all whispers carried scorn. From across the room, a guest frowned, eyes narrowing at Victoria's theatrics. A quiet murmur reached his neighbor, "That was too far. Way too far." The phones were everywhere now. Half a dozen angles captured the water still dripping from Amira's dress. Each frame destined for social media feeds before the night was over. Some held their screens high, faces glowing with the thrill of witnessing drama. Others tried to record discreetly, pretending to check messages while their cameras burned the humiliation into digital memory. Then came the laughter again, scattered at first, then rolling like a tide. A group of young men, heirs to mining fortunes they'd never earned, clapped each other on the shoulders. One of them, eyes bright with cruelty, leaned toward his friend. "She should be grateful. That water probably cost more than her entire outfit." Their laughter was harsh, meant to fill the void left by Amira's refusal to respond. A woman in pearls smirked as she adjusted her napkin. "She clearly doesn't belong here. Look at her, she can't even defend herself." Victoria, hearing these murmurs of support, lifted her empty pitcher once more like a conductor directing an orchestra of derision. She curtsied mockingly toward the still figure in African print, basking in the wave of validation. "Cheers to knowing your place," she announced, her voice ringing across the marble hall. More laughter, more applause, more clinking of champagne glasses. Yet beneath the noise, tension stirred. Not everyone was laughing. A pair of investors whispered behind their menus, concern etched across their faces. "Isn't she the one from the partnership? The contract we signed this morning." Another nodded grimly, eyes darting toward the water-soaked woman. "The $3.7 billion deal." Their amusement soured into worry. They knew what was at stake, even if Victoria didn't. Meanwhile, Amira remained motionless. She didn't wipe the water pooling at her collarbone. She didn't rise to defend herself. Her silence became its own performance, a mirror in which every cruel voice was forced to hear itself echo. The louder the crowd jeered, the more her composure magnified their ugliness. One young guest slowly lowered his phone, suddenly uncomfortable. He slipped it into his pocket and stared at his champagne instead. A woman beside him frowned, her laughter catching in her throat as she watched the still figure, soaked but unbroken. Something about the scene no longer felt amusing. It felt dangerous, as if the entire room was balanced on a knife's edge, waiting for the inevitable turn. Victoria, oblivious to the shifting mood, blew a theatrical kiss toward the audience of cameras. "Remember this night, everyone," she shouted, spinning in her sequined gown. "This is what happens when people forget their place in the natural order." Her laughter burst again, high and wild, filling every corner of the gilded hall. But in the quiet spaces beneath that laughter, in the pauses between gasps and claps, Eyes began to shift. The balance was changing. Not everyone was laughing anymore. Not everyone was blind to what was building in the silence. At the center of it all, water dripping steadily onto marble floors, CEO Amira Osei waited. Her gaze never wavered from Victoria's face. And in that stare was a promise that would soon reshape everything these people thought they knew about power. Water continued to drip from her temples, sliding past her cheeks and disappearing into the folds of her magnificent dress. Still, she sat with perfect posture, hands resting lightly on the table as if absolutely nothing had happened. Around her, the Sovereign Crown Club hummed with nervous energy, laughter that was too forced, whispers that cut too deep, the constant clinking of glasses used to mask growing unease. But when her eyes lifted fully, the ambient noise seemed to dim. She looked first at the empty pitcher in Victoria's manicured hands, now held like a weapon-turned-trophy. Then she raised her gaze higher, locking onto the woman in silver sequins. Victoria's smirk faltered for just a heartbeat, barely a flicker, but those watching caught it. Amira's stare was unhurried, deliberate, piercing. She didn't need to speak. The silence wrapped around her like armor, and the weight of it pressed into every corner of the room. Her composure had become the loudest thing in the hall. A ripple of discomfort spread outward. One guest shifted uneasily in his leather chair, suddenly aware of how harsh his laughter had sounded moments ago. Another woman lowered her phone, ashamed to be caught recording what was clearly becoming something bigger than entertainment. The cameras still pointed at their table, but their owners were no longer certain they wanted permanent proof of their participation in this scene. Victoria tossed her hair, forcing a brittle laugh that cracked slightly at the edges. "What's wrong? No comeback?" No words of wisdom from our distinguished visitor. Her voice carried across the room, but it lacked the confidence of before. She leaned closer, waving the pitcher in mock celebration. "You should thank me, really. No stylist in Melbourne could ever make you stand out quite like this." The cruelty met only silence. And then, slowly, deliberately, Amira blinked once, her lashes heavy with water droplets, before her eyes opened again. Cold. Unflinching. It was the look of someone who had already decided something. Someone who held power to end this entire charade with a single thought. Victoria felt it. She took a half-step backward, just enough for those nearby to notice. Murmurs stirred through the crowd. "Did you see that? She's not even angry." "No, she's waiting." Waiting for what? Amira adjusted her posture slightly, straightening in her chair with fluid grace. She lifted one hand, not to wipe away the water, but to place it gently on the stem of her untouched champagne glass. Her fingers curled around it with quiet certainty. The movement was small, but it commanded absolute attention. Her gaze never left Victoria's increasingly nervous face. She let the silence stretch like a taut wire, thick enough to drown the mocking giggles that tried desperately to spark back to life. The crowd leaned forward unconsciously, drawn by the magnetic pull of her stillness. In that charged pause, something fundamental shifted. The spectacle no longer belonged to the woman in sequins. The spotlight had moved, and every eye was now on the water-drenched figure at the table, not as a victim, but as the calm center of a storm no one else could see coming. Victoria forced another laugh, too loud, too hollow. She waved to the crowd as if to reclaim their attention, but her eyes kept flicking nervously back to the woman she tried to humiliate. And what stared back at her was no longer weakness. It was warning. The tension in the Sovereign Crown Club was thick enough to cut with a knife. Guests leaned closer to one another, voices dropping to urgent whispers, unease spreading through the room like cracks in ice. The water kept dripping. The silence kept deepening. And at the center of it all, Amira's eyes told a story that no one else dared speak aloud yet. This isn't over. This is just beginning. Victoria shifted her weight, designer heels clicking against the marble as she tried to recapture the room's energy. Her smile stretched wider, brittle as thin glass, The kind of grin that dared everyone to laugh with her or risk standing against her. She twirled the empty pitcher in her fingers, letting it dangle carelessly at her side like a casual threat. "Oops," she announced, voice dripping with mock innocence. "I suppose I got a little carried away there. But honestly, look at her now. She actually looks so much better this way, don't you think?" She gestured dramatically toward Amira, still seated, still silent, still dripping water like a statue carved from pure resolve. A few obedient chuckles followed from her inner circle. Scattered applause rose from her loyal supporters, desperate to keep feeding her ego. One man even clapped too enthusiastically, his laughter bouncing around the hall like shattered glass. But beyond that shallow ring of sycophants, the atmosphere wavered. Guests exchanged increasingly wary looks. A woman covered her discomfort with a long sip of champagne. An older gentleman adjusted his platinum cufflinks, studying the tablecloth rather than the spectacle before him. Victoria tilted her head back, still mistaking nervous energy for admiration. She raised her chin, her sequin dress catching the chandelier light, diamonds at her ears flashing with every exaggerated gesture. Beautiful, yes, but her beauty had curdled into something sharp and cruel. She strutted around the chair like a performer on stage, heels tapping out a rhythm of disdain against marble floors. "Tell me," she leaned close to Amira, her expensive perfume mixing with the scent of spilled water, her tone venomous. "How does it feel to sit among actual Australian royalty in your little ethnic costume and pretend you belong? Did you honestly think no one would notice the difference?" The room held its collective breath. Every syllable was calculated to wound. Every pause designed to humiliate. She wanted to break her target completely, not just with water, but with words that would strip away dignity layer by layer until nothing remained but shame. Then she laughed again, louder and shriller, turning toward the crowd with theatrical flair. "Don't be shy, everyone. Take a proper look. This is what happens when people climb too far above their natural station." Phones flashed. Glasses clinked. But the energy felt thinner now, stretched dangerously tight, ready to snap. Even those still laughing could feel the unease creeping beneath their own voices, the nagging thought that this performance had crossed a line they couldn't uncross. Amira remained immovable. Her silence was beginning to feel genuinely dangerous, like a storm gathering on the horizon with lightning building in its clouds. She didn't speak, but her presence communicated volumes. Her gaze followed Victoria's every exaggerated movement with calm precision, as though measuring the exact cost of each insult, calculating interest on every cruel word. Victoria tried to hold that stare but found herself glancing away repeatedly. She spun again, tossing her hair, twirling the empty pitcher in circles like a baton. She leaned deeper into her performance, convinced that enough theatrics could erase the tremor of doubt creeping into her chest. "Smile for the cameras, darling," she sneered, lowering her voice just enough for the nearest tables to hear. "This will be the only headline you'll ever make in this city." Her laughter spilled forth once more, but it sounded different now, thinner, more desperate, fighting against the heavy silence pressing back from the woman she'd tried to destroy. Across the hall, across the sea of Melbourne's elite, people were beginning to see it. The cruel show was no longer entertaining. It was unraveling in real time. Victoria didn't know it yet, but the moment she'd poured that water, she'd lit a fuse. And the woman she'd mocked was the one who would decide when it exploded. The laughter rippled through the dining room again, though weaker this time, forced like champagne that had lost its fizz. A handful of guests drummed their manicured fingers against white linen, eager to maintain the mood, desperate to remain on the side that seemed to hold social power. Their voices rose in hollow agreement. "Absolutely right," one young man called from the far end, his gold watch catching light as he raised his glass. "Some people need to learn their limits." His comment drew nervous chuckles from his table. Another voice, emboldened by the pack mentality, spoke louder than wisdom should have allowed. "If you want to play in the big leagues, you'd better learn to handle the pressure." His friends laughed too hard, trying to prove their membership in the same exclusive circle of cruelty. Victoria soaked up their support like sunlight. She turned toward them with arms spread wide, conducting the room itself like her personal orchestra. "See? They understand how things work here," she declared, voice dripping with vindication. She basked in the attention, twirling her pitcher like a conductor's baton. This is what happens when people forget where they came from and where they belong. But fractures were forming in her audience. Not everyone was laughing anymore. At a nearby table, a woman whispered sharply to her husband, "This has gone too far." He cleared his throat uncomfortably and looked away, unwilling to meet her disapproving eyes. At another corner of the room, two major investors exchanged glances heavy with unspoken concern. One murmured quietly, "Isn't she their new partner? The one from this morning's signing?" The other gave the faintest nod, both falling silent as they stared at their untouched meals, unwilling to participate in the farce but uncertain how to stop it. Yet the cruel chorus kept building. Phones hovered higher, recording everything from multiple angles. One guest deliberately framed his camera to capture Amira's water-soaked figure, zooming in on the streams running down her dark skin. He chuckled to himself, already composing the social media captions in his head. "Give us your best smile," someone shouted from across the hall. "Make it worth the footage." A roar of laughter followed, echoing off marble columns and bouncing beneath the crystal chandelier that had witnessed decades of Melbourne's social theatre. Victoria twirled once more, her sequined dress swirling dramatically around her legs. She blew an exaggerated kiss to the crowd, delighting in the mock applause that followed. "Don't any of you forget tonight," she cried, raising the empty pitcher high like a trophy. "This is the night an imposter got properly exposed." She bowed with theatrical flourish, reveling in her performance while the loyal ring of supporters clapped harder, their laughter rising again, desperate to feed her insatiable ego. But the energy was increasingly hollow, sustained more by social habit than genuine amusement. The room's pulse was changing, and some guests were beginning to sense it. In the center of it all, CEO Amira Osei maintained her silence. Her stillness only magnified the cruelty surrounding her, reflecting every laugh and jeer back onto those who gave them voice. One guest noticed the shift first. He slowly lowered his phone, slipping it into his jacket pocket as his eyes found the floor. A woman near him stopped laughing mid-breath, covering her mouth as if ashamed of the sound she'd been making. The balance was shifting, subtle but unmistakable. The spell was beginning to break. Victoria, intoxicated by her own bravado and blinded by sycophantic applause, missed these crucial signs entirely. She bowed again, hair cascading over her shoulders, her laughter high and piercing. "This is who she really is," she shouted, pointing dramatically at the water-soaked woman. "And this is all she'll ever amount to in our world." The applause that answered was softer this time, more scattered, distinctly uncertain. Doubt was creeping in at the edges. But Victoria only smiled wider, completely blind to the silence growing in the spaces between the laughs. She believed she was winning decisively. She had no idea that the floor beneath her designer heels was already beginning to crack. The water dripped slower now, dark stains spreading across the vibrant African print, but Amira did not move a muscle. She sat anchored in her chair as though it were a throne, and the entire Sovereign Crown Club had unwillingly become her court. Her silence wasn't surrender, it was calculation of the highest order. In her mind, the morning's events replayed with crystal clarity. Signatures scrolling across legal documents. Press releases drafted but not yet published. Numbers that stretched into the billions. 3.7. A mining partnership celebrated as unshakable, a deal that would reshape Australia's resource landscape. And now, within a single evening, her so-called partner's sister had transformed that alliance into a spectacle of public humiliation. Victoria laughed again, tossing her perfectly styled hair, clinging desperately to the sound of her own arrogance. "What's the matter now?" she mocked, leaning close enough for her designer perfume to clash with the clean scent of spilled water. "Has the cat got your tongue?" I thought powerful women always had something clever to say. Amira's eyes didn't even flicker. She studied her tormentor with unnerving calm, her gaze slow and methodical. She wasn't looking at the water stains. She wasn't looking at the jeering crowd. She was looking at arrogance itself, measuring it, weighing it, deciding its ultimate cost. "You think this is power?" her thoughts whispered in the profound silence. "A picture, a laugh, a crowd eager to applaud cruelty? Real power doesn't need an audience. Real power changes the numbers that built this room. The ink on contracts your family depends on." The din of voices around her blurred into background noise. Every insult, every cruel laugh, every whispered comment merged into white noise. All she could hear clearly was the echo of her own resolve crystallizing. She placed one hand flat against the linen tablecloth, steady, deliberate, firm. The gesture was small, but it commanded immediate attention. Several nearby guests glanced down, sensing something shifting beneath the surface but unable to name what they felt. Her other hand moved with equal precision, lifting the folded cloth napkin from her lap. She dabbed gently at her jaw, removing a thin stream of water without any hint of hurry or shame. This wasn't a gesture of weakness. This was control made visible. Victoria smirked triumphantly. "Finally cleaning yourself up? About time, I'd say." Her words were meant to carry across the room, but they seemed to stumble in the air, brittle against the silence that followed Amira's calm, deliberate movements. Inside her mind, the decision crystallized completely. Every insult, every laugh, every drop of water sliding down her skin was being tallied, converted into a calculation that would reshape the entire evening. The sum was devastatingly clear: $3.7 billion, about to be erased with a single word. Her eyes rose once more, meeting Victoria's gaze with direct, unwavering certainty. Not anger, not defiance, just the kind of absolute certainty that unsettled even the most reckless personalities. Across the dining hall, several guests shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. They couldn't explain what they were feeling, but they sensed it, the storm building behind those calm eyes, the inevitability of consequence gathering like thunder. Victoria faltered again, just for a heartbeat. She raised her chin higher, trying to smother her growing doubt with another forced laugh. But the crack in her confidence had already appeared. And in the silence stretching between them, Amira thought only one thing. "Your family believes they poured water on some outsider. They have no idea I'm about to pour billions out of their reach forever." The napkin was folded with care and returned to the table, as though the water stain upon it meant absolutely nothing at all. Amira's hands returned to perfect stillness. Her gaze swept the Sovereign Crown Club methodically, not hurried, not seeking sympathy, simply observing with the detached interest of someone conducting an audit. Each guest felt the weight of her attention when those eyes passed over them. Some averted their faces entirely. Others pretended to study their champagne. The air grew thick and fragile, every ambient sound sharp against the silence she commanded effortlessly. Victoria mistook that quiet for victory. She strutted closer, designer heels striking marble with deliberate rhythm that echoed off vaulted ceilings. "There it is," she said loudly, turning toward the crowd as if delivering the final line of a carefully rehearsed play. The silence of someone who finally understands she doesn't belong. A few people clapped on cue. A nervous ripple of laughter followed like an aftershock, but Amira remained completely unbothered by the performance. Her stillness was no longer defensive. It had become strategic. She reached calmly for her phone, the screen illuminating softly in her palm. Her fingers moved with unhurried precision, one tap, then another. She lifted the device to her ear with the same casual grace she might use to check the time. The shift in the room was immediate and electric. The crowd leaned forward, suddenly curious despite themselves. Victoria tilted her head, her smirk widening with false confidence. "Oh, how precious," she announced to her audience. "She's calling for backup. Maybe her driver can bring her a proper towel?" Her words were meant to sting, but her voice moved too quickly, too eager to fill the space that Amira's silence had claimed. When Amira's voice finally came, it was nothing like Victoria's theatrical proclamations. Each word dropped like steel into the silence, calm, cold, absolute. Terminate the Blackstone mining contract. Effective immediately. A hush fell heavier than anything the room had experienced. The entire club seemed to contract, the very air pressing inward as though the building itself was holding its breath. Even the string quartet in the corner stumbled over their instruments, bows faltering against strings as the musicians exchanged confused glances. Conversations didn't just pause, they died mid-syllable. Eyes widened in genuine shock. Nervous glances darted between tables like sparks jumping between live wires. Amira ended the call without ceremony, setting her phone beside her water glass as though it were nothing more than a minor interruption to dinner. Then she folded her hands once more, posture unchanging, eyes forward, waiting. Victoria blinked rapidly, her practiced laugh catching in her throat like broken glass. What did she just say?" she asked, forcing another chuckle, but it rang completely hollow in the sudden vacuum. No one answered. No one could. The crowd's focus had shifted entirely away from the woman in sequins. Every eye was locked onto the water-drenched figure at the table, the one who had spoken just 5 words yet somehow shifted the entire universe of the room. A man at the far end of the club pulled out his own phone, scrolling frantically through financial alerts. His face drained of color as the information loaded. He nudged his neighbor urgently, whispering with barely controlled panic. Another guest's screen lit up, displaying market notifications that made his hands tremble. The whispers began spreading faster, sharper, more desperate. "She can't mean the Blackstone deal? Today's contract, the mining rights. 3.7 billion. Victoria's practiced smile began to waver dangerously. She tried to wave her empty pitcher again, commanding attention through sheer force of will. "She's obviously bluffing," she scoffed, but her eyes flickered with the first real doubt she'd shown all evening. Amira said nothing more. She didn't need to. Her silence was now louder than any declaration, more powerful than any threat. The weight of what had just transpired began settling across the Sovereign Crown Club like ash after a volcanic eruption. The performance was unraveling completely, and Victoria was the only person in the room who didn't yet realize how utterly she'd lost control. At the center of the chaos, soaked in water yet somehow untouchable, Amira sat in perfect composure. Her silence had become a verdict that would reshape Australian mining forever. The seconds stretched endlessly, every eye darting between the woman in vibrant African print and Victoria in her now tarnished sequins. The buzz of whispers grew into a low rumble, like distant thunder warning of an approaching storm. Words collided and scattered and rose again. Contract, terminated, billions. Somewhere near the back of the dining room, a phone chimed with a financial alert. Then another. And another. The sound spread through the crowd like digital wildfire. The first man to check his screen went pale as death. "Oh my God," he muttered, fingers trembling as he scrolled through the breaking news. "It's real. She's actually pulling out." His dinner companion leaned over, eyes widening at the numbers flashing across the display. 3.7 billion, just gone. Screens lit up around the room like a constellation of panic. Notifications spread faster than gossip. The contract termination, the massive investment, the billions suddenly evaporating into thin air. The headlines weren't even written yet, but financial tremors were already shaking the foundations of Melbourne's business district. A woman clutched her husband's arm with white knuckles. She didn't just threaten, she actually... The words trailed off into stunned disbelief. "She did," he whispered, his voice raw with shock. 3.7 billion wiped clean with a phone call. The string quartet had stopped playing entirely. Their bows hung frozen above silent instruments, waiting for permission to continue that would never come. The only sound was Victoria pacing, her heels clicking against marble in increasingly erratic rhythms. Her smile was cracking like glass under pressure. "She's bluffing," she insisted, her voice climbing higher with desperation. "This is just drama, theater, a party trick. My family, the Blackstones, we control half the mining rights in this country. She can't just..." But her voice no longer commanded the room. It was being swallowed by the truth scrolling across every device, by the crushing weight of silence building around the water-soaked figure who had spoken 5 words and dismantled an empire's worth of arrogance. Amira reached for her champagne glass, not the empty pitcher that had been wielded like a weapon, but her own crystal flute, still half full and untouched by the chaos. She lifted it with a steady hand, completely unshaken despite the water still dripping from her sleeves. She raised it to her lips, took one measured sip, then set it back down with quiet, absolute grace. No announcement. No explanation. No gloating. Only composure. The dining hall erupted, not with laughter or applause, but with a storm of whispers that felt louder than any celebration. Chairs scraped against marble as guests leaned desperately toward one another, frantically trying to piece together the magnitude of what had just unraveled before their eyes. Some sat rigid, too stunned to move. Others were already taking notes, thinking of emergency board meetings and headlines that would dominate tomorrow's financial news. Victoria's breathing quickened visibly. She spun back toward the woman she'd tried to humiliate, sequins catching light with each frantic movement. "You think you can intimidate me with this little performance?" she demanded, but the tremor in her voice betrayed every word. Amira finally lifted her eyes again, calm as still water, meeting her tormentor's gaze with the same unflinching steel that had commanded the room's attention from the very beginning. She didn't answer Victoria's question. The room itself had already answered for her. Because everyone now understood with crystal clarity, this had never been theater. This was power in its purest form. And Victoria's laughter, her cruelty, her arrogance, all of it was breaking apart like waves against an unmoving cliff. Victoria's laugh tried to rise again, brittle and desperately forced, but it shattered before it could fill the space between them. The audience no longer belonged to her. The guests had shifted completely in their seats, their faces illuminated by the cold glow of phone screens, their murmurs sharpened with genuine urgency. No one cared about her theatrics anymore. They cared about numbers, about markets, about the financial earthquake trembling beneath their own fortunes. One man near the head table barked into his phone, his voice shaking, "Sell everything. Sell it now." His words carried across the dining room like a fire alarm, sparking more frantic calls, more desperate whispers. A woman in silk gripped her designer clutch so tightly her knuckles went white. She stared across the room at the water-drenched figure and whispered, almost to herself, "She actually did it. She really destroyed them." Victoria spun on her designer heels, sequined dress fanning dramatically as if movement alone could pull the spotlight back to her. "Don't listen to her lies," she shouted, but her words rang hollow, swallowed by the rising storm of panic around her. "She doesn't have real power. My family, the Blackstones, we built this industry." But the crowd had moved beyond listening. They had seen enough. They had heard enough. The silence of CEO Amira Osei had spoken louder than Victoria's shrillest protests could ever manage. Amira, still seated like royalty, adjusted her posture with effortless grace. She placed both hands flat against the white linen, fingers relaxed, eyes scanning the dining hall as though she were surveying territory that had always belonged to her. The balance in the room had shifted, and everyone sensed it. Amira sat straight in her chair, damp fabric still clinging to her, and rested her chin on her hand with quiet ease. She no longer needed to argue. Silence itself carried the judgment, and her composure delivered the punishment. Victoria faltered, stumbling as her heel caught against the stone floor. Her gaze darted wildly from face to face, searching for the companions who once laughed beside her, for the supporters who had cheered her insults. But none of them looked her way. Their eyes were fixed instead on the woman she had attempted to belittle, the woman who now appeared untouchable. The atmosphere of the hall had shifted entirely around her. A low murmur began to ripple again. This time it was not about embarrassment or scandal but about influence, about empires moved with a single decision, about the woman who endured humiliation and yet emerged as the central figure in the room. In that instant, admiration turned away from inherited privilege and toward strength proven under fire. Amira lifted her glass with calm precision, took a slow drink, and placed it gently back down. Her gaze swept over the crowd. One by one, heads bowed and conversations fell silent. Phones lowered. No one dared to laugh now. Those who had joined in cruelty before sat stiff and speechless. Others, who had watched in discomfort earlier, leaned forward now, unable to hide the respect in their eyes. Finally she spoke, her voice low yet resonant enough to carry through the entire chamber. Dignity is not erased by spilled water. It does not collapse under ridicule. Dignity remains. And tonight you have all discovered who truly possesses it. The words struck like iron, firm and unshakable. This time the whispers that followed carried recognition rather than mockery. Investors exchanged loaded glances, weighing futures that had just been rewritten. At the far end, a woman bent toward her companion. She commands the room. She commands tomorrow. The answer came, grim and certain. And she controls the agreement that just slipped away. Amira rose at last. The movement was slow but carried the weight of thunder. The wet marks on her dress gleamed beneath the lights, no longer symbols of disgrace but living proof. Even drenched in cruelty, she remained untouchable. A few guests rose as she did, moved by some mixture of awe and fear. She turned toward the exit, her steps deliberate, each one echoing through the silence. No one barred her path. No one dared. The assembly shifted aside, parting as though before royalty. At the doorway she paused and looked back, not at the shattered glass, but at the crowd itself. Her eyes swept across them, calm and steady. Authority is not created by display, she said. It is revealed in what follows. With that she stepped through the doors, leaving behind a hall not filled with laughter but with reverence. The guests remained frozen in her wake. Later, conversations would surface in boardrooms, on trading floors, and across the press. For the moment, silence told the story. She had entered the gathering as just another guest. She departed as the only person that mattered.